My name is Renee Magyar. I'm with West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and we're excited to learn about integrated pest management today. We're hosting this webinar series with our partner, Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And West Multnomah's mission is to provide resources, information, and expertise to inspire people to actively improve air and water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and soil health. And we serve residents of Western Multnomah County, Selby Island, and a portion of the Bonnie Slope neighborhood with conservation planning, weed management, native plants, wildlife habitat restoration, and school and community gardens. And Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District's mission is to create a sustainable, productive, and healthy environment for the Washington County community. And they serve residents by providing educational opportunities, advice about natural resource conservation, and financial assistance for conservation projects. And if you have any questions about natural resources management, we encourage you to get in touch with your local soil and water conservation district. So tonight we are here to talk about integrated pest management. And as we discuss this important topic, it's important for our district to acknowledge the original stewards, the indigenous people of the land where we now provide conservation services, and their deep and extensive knowledge of this land. We honor all tribes on the land covered by the participants in this far-reaching workshop and beyond by committing to work with their descendants and learn from their traditional ecological knowledge and regional worldview of the land and all things living upon it. We further recognize that we are here because of land displacement and attempts at cultural erasure and other sacrifices that were forced upon them. And we also remind ourselves that we're guests of this land and must do our best to honor the original peoples through authentic cultural narratives and continued caring of and giving to the air, water, plants, animals, soils, and the ecosystems that make up this land community. So now I have a few housekeeping tips for you. We're recording all of the sessions of Soil School, and they'll be available on Tualatin's YouTube channel by the end of the month. And we'll be posting a link to that in the chat. But you can also certainly go onto YouTube and Google, or sorry, search for Tualatin and they'll come up. Tonight's presentation will be 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you would please put your questions in the Q&A window and not in the chat window. And there's an option also to upvote questions. There's a little thumbs up. And if you do that, it'll bring the questions to the top of the list, and it'll show which ones are the most popular for answering in case we aren't able to get to all questions. And also, we want to know what you think about tonight's session. We really definitely value your input, and it helps us make Soil School better each year. So look for a link to that in the chat, and I think Cammie's gonna paste that in there for us. And so now I'm honored to introduce tonight's presenter, Weston Miller. Weston serves as community and urban horticulturist for Oregon State University Extension Service. And since 2007, he has managed the popular Master Gardener program in Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington counties. And Weston is also the program manager for Solve Pest Problems for Oregon State, and is working with the university and stakeholders to plan and initiate this statewide outreach program. And Weston also serves as elected director and treasurer for West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. So thank you for that, and welcome, Weston.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Howdy, everyone. Good to be here tonight. Thanks for joining. Again, my name is Weston Miller. Tonight's presentation is on integrated pest management. And to define integrated pest management, say that it's a decision-making tool that people can use to weigh the benefits and risks of pests and of pest control options. And we encourage people to use IPM to make informed decisions for whatever property you manage, whether that's a container garden on your porch to 100 acres in the West Hills. IPM is a really important tool for you as a land manager. Here's a preview of what we're going to talk about. So going to define IPM for you and use rodents, the all familiar rodents as an example. Going to talk about the context for IPM in terms of invasive plants in urban areas. And then going to talk about plant problems, some signs and symptoms like what to look out for, and use Coddling Moth, an example of an insect pest for plants, apple scab as another example, and then also going to provide you a little bit of a preview for Solve Pest Problems, a project that I'm working on that Renee described. Definitely post your questions in the Q&A. I'll get to them at the end. So integrated pest management is just a great decision-making process. And what it starts with is identifying the pest. And when you do that, you're going to learn its biology. So what is its life cycle like? In the photo here, it's knotweed. Knotweed is an invasive herbaceous plant. So right about now, spring into the ground. It died back in the wintertime. And then it spreads by seed a little bit, but mostly by underground root systems. It is a tough weed to deal with. And then you want to determine control options. And when you're doing that, you want to basically weigh the benefits and the risks of each of those options. And then each situation is different. And it depends on you and your tolerances for pests, depends on what your goals are. And then you'll implement control actions based on those details. And then the thing about integrated pest management is it's not an event, it's a process. And what you really need to do is monitor, look for the pest moving forward, and repeat control action as needed. And then really importantly, it's a cycle too. So what can you do to prevent pests from the first place? In the case of knotweed, do whatever you can to keep it from coming onto your property. So I would be really careful about moving any soil onto your property, careful about moving equipment that had been working in a knotweed area on your property, careful about if you're on a stream, it floating down and landing on your property, and then knowing what to look for and how to find it and rogue things out if they become established early on. And just a quick preview about the different kinds of pests that are out there. This is a screenshot of Solve Pest Problems home screen. And we've got mice, rats, and wildlife, yellow jackets and wasps, ants, spiders, fleas, so insect pests, lots and lots of weeds here in Western Oregon, as you know. But then lawn problems are mostly cosmetic, but certainly people spend a lot of time and effort dealing with weeds and insects and things like that in their lawns. Moss can be a challenge for roofs and walkways. Mold is also a really important pest as well in homes. It's a health hazard. And then a huge realm of integrated pest management is focused on slugs, diseases, insects on plants. And then lastly, invasive and aggressive species kind of within all of those other groups as well. So who's had rodents in their house before? It's a super common pest, and they're both invasive, not from North America, mice and rats. And with both of them, they're cohabitating with people. So we provide shelter for them, we provide food for them, and then they make their way into our structures and become a problem. And as you know, rodents reproduce really rapidly. They're also a human health threat. So diseases transferred via mouse feces, the urine and feces can basically trigger asthma as well. And both rats and mice also cause property damage. You can see damage to the wall. You can see all of the feces on the ground. No fun at all. The big thing you need to know about rodent control, as an example, is that you have to implement kind of all of the strategies from the get-go. And that starts with removing food sources and rodent proofing a building. On your left-hand side, you can see the mouse with food. On your right-hand side, just a little hole, 1 square inch is big enough for a mouse and rat to get into a home. So you really need to work on making sure your structure is going to keep them out in the first place. And then with the various control options, trapping certainly works. It's not going to work very well unless you get rid of the food source and exclude rodents in the first place. And then toxic baits are also available. And the thing about toxic baits is that they're also, since rodents are mammals, the baits are also super toxic for humans and dogs and wildlife as well. So the biggest recommendation with using toxic bait is that you also use a a bait station, as you can see in the photo there, to reduce the risk of people and pets and kids finding it. And then more about mitigating the risks of the option. So if you're going to be trapping, then you got to worry about disease transmission, and you'd want to sort of spray things, like let's say the trap caught a mouse, spray it with bleach and use rubber gloves to pick it up and to dispose of the trap. And then with rodenticides, I already mentioned, using bait stations, but super important, read and follow the label instructions. Don't ever leave bait unattended, and then follow the label instructions for disposal of it. So that's a preview. It's sort of an example of the IPM process. Starts with prevention, doing the non-chemical things first, like trapping, and then finally with the rodenticides, and then monitoring. Did it actually work? And taking action over time to make sure that you don't have them come back. Like not leaving food out and making sure they don't have access into your structures are key preventative strategies for rodents. All right, shifting gears. Now we're going to talk about invasive plants in urban areas and some of the reasons why there are so many invasive plants in especially the Portland metro area. One is we have a lot of disturbed soil. Weeds are typically aggressive pioneer plants that grow really well in disturbed soil. You can see the shiny geranium patch there along the road. And then there's also a lot of neglected areas, like between people's properties, along freeways and things like that. You can see a cherry laurel. The seeds are spread by birds growing in a fenced area between two properties. Also, people have planted a lot of plants that tend to get out of control. In the photo on the left-hand side, yellow archangel is one example of those, where it's a mint family plant. It spreads by stolons over the ground and forms a really thick mat. And then you've probably seen tree of heaven. It was planted because the name implies it's kind of a nice tree, but it's also really aggressive. So a lot of folks in urban areas don't necessarily know that tree of heaven is a problem, and they probably also don't have the skills and knowledge to be able to deal with it as well. You can see this is the blue building there in the Hawthorne neighborhood, tree of heaven growing right there and damaging the foundation. It's also really important to point out that we live in a changing world, and we are expecting that with climate change, it's going to help invasive species. For example, with the purple loosestrife in the photo there, longer seasons and warmer weather have led to increased proliferation of plants like purple loosestrife and many others. So plants are temperature dependent. If their season starts a little bit early and goes a little bit longer, they're going to have more opportunity to spread during the course of a growing season. And in the photo on the left, purple loosestrife is blooming 24 days earlier than it did a century ago. So what we know is that with climate change, it's going to change the competitive behavior of weeds, their proliferation, and it's going to also change where they grow in terms of latitude. So weeds from the south moving north, and where it's going to grow in terms of elevation as well. Weeds like, let's call it Scotch broom, moving up into higher elevation areas. And it also changes the phenology, the yearly life cycle. And my colleagues at OSU in the small farms and agriculture realm tell me that voles are also having a field day with the milder winters that we've been having. Voles are field mice, meadow mice, and they live in grassy areas. And if it's a little bit warmer during the winter, it means that they're able to have additional litters of young during the year. So voles, in addition to plants, in addition to insects, are all sort of increasing in prevalence and severity to some degree. With invasive plant management, let's think about it in terms of you need to watch for regrowth, so monitoring. So if you have a patch of knotweed, you saw it in the first slide of the presentation, if you treat that, it's going to come back the year after that, and maybe a year after that, and you're going to need to treat it. And then you also need to cover up the soil in some way. So this is a photo from Laura Taylor at West Multnomah SWCD, where reed canary grass was controlled, cedars are planted, but each year people are going back and controlling the reed canary grass. Otherwise, it's going to overwhelm the trees and they're not going to get established. Eventually, the cedars will grow and shade out the grass, but that's going to take a number of years. There's also, just in terms of what you choose to do and how if you're going to use herbicides specifically, got to think about the site itself. And if you have a shallow water table or really sandy soil, urge you to use caution with herbicides. And then a lot of folks use like sort of weed preventer in landscape areas. But if that's put onto the ground and then the soil erodes, then that material is going to make its way into waterways, and that's not a good thing. I'm going to use a couple examples of invasive weeds here. And we're going to start with ivy, the ever-present evergreen vine that we have here all over the metro area in Western Oregon. And with ivy, it's got the waxy leaves. It has various shapes. Ivy is spread by the birds. So the birds eat the berries, they go and fly into the forest and they deposit it there, or they might be sitting on a shrub on your property and deposit it there. And then once established, the plants spread vegetatively as well, forming a pretty dense, nasty mat. In terms of dealing with ivy, your choices are physical work. So basically chipping away and peeling back the mat and making a big ball of it. Also really important to keep it from growing vertically. When ivy gets full sun, that's when it's going to be producing the berries. So first of all, removing it from trees. You can see the worker here in the photo is basically cutting a 2-foot section out of the ivy vine. You leave the vines in the tree. You don't want to pull those down. You could hurt yourself. You could damage birds, but you have a missing chunk of the vine. So they're going to eventually, the vines will starve. They won't have any nutrients, and then start peeling it away from the base of the tree. All of that's definitely a lot of work. What are you going to do with all that ivy? There will be a lot of plant material. If you have access, you can definitely just haul it away and take it to green waste where hot composting will destroy the plant material. Or if you're in a more remote location, you can compost it in place. And you can see in the photo here, the pile of ivy is put up on some logs to keep it out of contact with the ground so that it doesn't reroot and keep growing. Also, in more of a landscape scenario, ivy, when it is mowed on a regular basis, let's call it like every couple years, it's going to stay put and not send up the vertical shoots and create berries. So in that way, you can keep a patch of ivy relatively contained by mowing it. And it's important to point out that ivy with its really thick leaves is not very susceptible to herbicides. So one trick, if you choose to use herbicides to kill ivy, is to mow it first and then let the green, newer leaves, less waxy leaves come back, and then to treat that. In terms of treating it, glyphosate, triclopyr, both work. Also a mixture, both in tank and or over time, would be another way to go about treating ivy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to monitor it and then treat it as needed over time. So one application is probably not going to do the trick. It's probably going to take at least a couple applications, and then the next year you might have a couple additional sprigs of ivy to deal with. Another example of IPM using invasive plants as an example is Tree of Heaven. And Tree of Heaven is a deciduous tree. It's woody, it has many stems and these big compound leaves. And it grows in really, really harsh locations, as you can see on the left side. It sprouts in cement and patios and foundations and so on. With Tree of Heaven, there's separate male and female trees. The female trees have the samaras, the seeds you can see there. Those are going to be spread by wind and by water. And then they also spread with a really extensive root system underground, very difficult to control. So even just a sapling that you can see on the left-hand side, it's going to be really hard to dig out. They have deep, really established root systems, probably connected to other Tree of Heaven in the area. So not very practical, but it is certainly susceptible to herbicide, and the techniques would be key. And that is basal bark, like you can see on the left-hand middle photo there, where you're adding a adjuvant to the herbicide and then spraying it at the base of the tree. The herbicide will soak in, get into the root system, and eventually kill the tree. You'll still probably have to, after it's dead, cut down and remove the standing tree, but it certainly will work to kill it. The other technique is the frill application, where use a hatchet to cut whole, like a gash in the cambium of the tree, and then concentrated herbicide is sprayed in that. You basically collar the plant by making the cuts all the way around, and then that it's going to eventually work its way down into the roots and kill the tree. And then again, you'll have to remove the tree once it's dead. And then just another example for you of invasive plant management, and that is with old man's beard, the Clematis vitalba. And it's pretty easy to identify in terms of it's a deciduous perennial vine. It's got the white seed heads in the winter and fall, and the seeds are spread by animals, by wind, by water. And then digging out just a relatively small section or small plant is going to take a fair amount of work. They get really well established. And then with herbicides, the options are the basal bark treatment that I just described, and the cut stump application, where you can cut the vine off with loppers and then spray right when you have a fresh cut, spray that stump with herbicide, and that's going to work its way into the root system and kill it. So as I'm going through these, notice that try to do the non-chemical things first, and then if you need to in IPM, it's considering all the different treatment options available. It's weighing the benefits and the risks of all of those. And then one more example of a plant for you, and that is shiny geranium. You'll see it right about now. It's going to start flowering very, very soon. And shiny geranium is an annual, and it forms very, very dense patches. It has little explosive seed capsules. So when they dry out, they explode, spreading the seeds up to about 20 feet or so. The seeds are very textured, so they're going to stick to animals and to shoes and make their way to new locations. I'm betting you've seen a lot of shiny geranium growing along roadsides. But the thing about shiny geraniums is actually really pretty easy to pull out. Doesn't have a very robust root system at all. So with hand tools, you can absolutely, right about now would be a great time to do it when the soil is wet and they haven't started to flower yet. You could remove a big patch of shiny geranium relatively quickly. A couple other things that might work for you. Since it's an annual, if you wanted to try flame weeding, you could. It's kind of fun. You get to use a propane torch and you can just sort of pass it over the plants. It's going to work especially in the fall when the plants are very small and just emerging, and the heat disrupts the chloroplast, excuse me, the water membranes in the plants, and then they die. Also, as an annual, if it doesn't germinate, it won't grow. So you can smother the shiny geranium seeds using sheet mulching methods like you can see on the right-hand side. And then really importantly, covering the exposed soil. So if you're going to remove Tree of Heaven, you got to try to shade it out somehow. And you can see a really thick stand of native plants on the right-hand side. And then in terms of treatment, herbicides are going to work pretty well to kill it for sure. You'd want to try to catch it before it starts flowering. So that's using the IPM process to talk about invasive plants. We're going to shift gears now and talk about IPM with relation to plant problems. And what I'll say with plant problems, first of all, is people tend to blame insects and diseases for plant problems, but it turns out that a lot of plant problems are actually caused by non-living factors. So you want to try to think of uniform. So if like a whole set of arborvitae, like a whole hedge of arborvitae is dying, it's probably not an insect or a disease. It's probably a non-living factor like drought stress. And then if you see like 1 of 10 arborvitae starting to die and just part of the tree is sort of flagging, then you might be like, maybe it's a non-living thing. So if it's a uniform pattern, think non-living. And if it's a non-uniform pattern, think that it's probably a living organism. And what you want to do is basically think about what are those non-living abiotic causes, weather, heat, cold, mechanical damage, nutrient deficiencies. In the photo here, that's the yellowing of the corn is caused by nutrient deficiency, nitrogen deficiency. Also, there's toxins. So with OSU and the Master Gardener program, we answer thousands of questions per year from the public about what's wrong with my plant. And I would guess that somewhere around 70% or more of those questions are caused by non-living factors. And then also, it's very important to point out that stressed plants are more susceptible to pests and diseases. Speaking of stressed plants, you all probably remember the heat dome last summer in June. So beyond that, we are noticing that old standby plants in the Northwest, like rhododendrons and like Western red cedar and even Douglas fir, if they are starting to not do as well as they used to because of the extended drought that we've had. And then really hot events like we had last summer certainly don't help the cause. So the rhododendron on the left-hand side, planted in full sun, not the right location. And then this was last summer in July after it got torched. And then on the right-hand side, that's in Washington County, and someone was getting excited about their cedar hedge, and they just didn't set them up with enough drip emitters. So each of those trees only had one emitter, so it's not going to be enough to get them established, and someone's wasting thousands of dollars of tree material right there. All right, so as opposed to things like drought stress, then the living causes of plant damage include vertebrate pests, so that would be deer and voles and gophers, and then insects and mites, and then all these diseases, nematodes, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. The photo here shows aphids on broccoli. And you want to look for signs and symptoms. Signs are basically direct evidence of an organism, and you can see bacterial canker, the ooze coming out of the cherry tree on the left-hand side. And the symptom is a plant's response to a stressor. And on the right-hand side, you can see drought stress in zucchini plants. When you see aphids, that's a sign, direct evidence of an organism. When you see damage, like on the right-hand side, all the ragged holes caused by imported cabbage moth, that's another sign of a plant problem. And symptoms are more of the plant's responses to a stress, whether that's living or non-living. On your left-hand side, if you've ever tried to grow flats of broccoli or something like that, you might have gotten damping off fungus. Damping off is ubiquitous. It's in the soil. It's there all the time. When conditions are right, the fungus will impact plants and they'll just tip over and die. On the right-hand side, it's a symptom of a non-living plant problem, tomato blossom end rot, which is caused by calcium deficiency or irregular watering. So signs and symptoms are really important in terms of trying to diagnose plant problems. And then what you want to do is, if you know that you have a living organism that's causing a problem to your plants, then you'll want to think about, well, what can you do to disrupt the life cycle of that organism? That starts by doing research to understand, well, what is the cause of it? So in this case, who had slugs and snails in their garden? So here we are in Western Oregon. The brown garden slug is definitely a thing. Snails are also here. We have native slugs like banana slugs, and they're not really a problem in gardens. It's really the invasive ones. So what if you know that with slugs in their life cycle, they lay their eggs somewhere around late summer, so August into September, and that's a really good time to go out and find where slugs hang out. They hang out under boards, under bricks, in plant debris, somewhere hiding, basically. And if you find their eggs at that time, then you can squash them, and then you will have 20, 30 less slugs the following year. So by trying to break the life cycle, it's the very sort of most important part of integrated pest management. Is you want to sort of do the least amount of effort that's going to break the life cycle of the organism. And that's speaking of slugs. So we kind of break down control options in terms of non-chemical and chemical. And with slugs, it starts by, well, where do slugs hang out? You can eliminate their habitat. So they hang out when plants are like flopped to the ground. They hang out when you leave pots out on the patio underneath them, and so on. Also, encourage predators. It turns out that birds, garter snakes, ground beetles, those are all predators of slugs. So leaving little brush piles for garter snakes, having shrubs to attract birds, ground beetles hang out sort of in the same places that slugs do as well. Also, you can use like a board put out on the ground as a trap for slugs. So if you know you have slugs near your lettuce patch, put a piece of plywood out there and then go and pull the plywood up and you'll find all the slugs there in one convenient location. You can pull them off and drop them into soapy water or squash them if you like. Slug patrol is really kind of fun and easy. You can go out at night with a flashlight. I used to pay my kids 5 cents a slugs, and that went pretty far. And then once you have done all those things, then you might consider using baits. So for really sensitive plants like lettuces and broccoli, you could try using the baits. And iron phosphate is an organic slug bait. It's relatively effective. It's kind of slow acting. And then the other option is metaldehyde, which is toxic to kids and pets. So if you have those around, you probably wouldn't want to use that particular material. So again, you're doing all the non-chemical things first in IPM. And then when it comes to using chemical management, it's weighing the benefits and the risks of each. For a lot of people, they don't want to use any bait at all, and that's totally fine. And for people who do, just know what you're getting into and protect kids and pets if needed. Alrighty, we're going to use the case study of apple codling moth to go through the IPM process with regards to a plant. So first of all, codling moth, if you've ever grown apples on your property, surely you've gotten codling moth. Codling moth are moths, as the name implies. Right about now, they have been overwintering in debris, especially in fallen fruit, but they can also overwinter in folds in the bark and leaves at the base of the tree and so on. And then coming up real soon, the adults will they overwinter as pupa, and then the adults will fly coming up in the spring, and the adults lay their eggs, the larvae form, and then the larvae are the ones that get into the fruit. So adults sort of sting the edge of the apple, and that inserts their ovipositor into the apple. The larvae emerge, they squirm their way through the fruit, and they cause some fairly severe damage. And then in our area, with our relatively warm summers, mild conditions, they're going to have 2, 3, 4 generations per year. So that by the time you get to apple harvest season in August, September, and October, and so if you haven't really dealt with apple codling moth, then it's likely that most of your fruit won't really be very edible. You could certainly cut chunks off if you need and still eat apples and still make some cider out of it and so on, but you're not going to really get awesome apples. So one of the very first steps with dealing with codling moth is to think about hygiene. So at the end of the season, raking and during the course of the season too, when apples fall, they're probably getting aborted because of codling moth. So picking them up during the season and then putting them in a green yard debris bin, or if you're in a rural property, a hot compost pile, or burying it. But the idea is you want to get the remnants of the fruit out of there to try to break their disease cycle as best you can. And then in commercial orchards, they use pheromone traps to monitor for codling moth. And the idea is that the pheromone attracts the males, and the males stick to it, And that's a sign that when they're flying, that's when spray applications are going to be best timed. You could also, if you have just a couple apple trees, buy yourself 5 or 10 pheromone traps for codling moth, put them around, and the codling moth the males will stick to it. It's going to disrupt the mating cycle to a degree. Also, really conveniently, you can basically have a barrier that keeps the codling moth from the larva, the adults from being able to lay the eggs, or the larva from being able to crawl onto the fruit. And the photo is not a great photo. I'm sorry about that. It shows nylon footies wrapped around individual apples. And the nylon footies also can be soaked in kale and clay, which helps to serve as an irritant for the insects. So if you just have a couple trees, and here's where having small dwarfing apple trees really makes sense, you can very much tie on 30 or 40 of these in an hour or so and protect the bulk of your fruit. So for me, I have a couple dwarf apple trees, and I use the footies, and I get some pretty good apples every year. In terms of the insecticide options, if you drive out to Hood River right about now, you would see the white ghostly trees like you can see in the photo here, and that's kale and clay that's been sprayed on the trees. And with kale and clay, it's basically very small clay particles. It's going to disrupt the cuticle of the insect, the larva, as they're crawling. Also, with the case of codling moth, there's a bacteria, or excuse me, a virus that's specific and kills just the codling moth and not other organisms. So where there is a targeted insecticide, especially a biological insecticide that targets just what you're going for and doesn't have collateral damage, then that would be a really good choice. So that's called Sidex. And then there's another OMRI approved spinosad. It's a bacterial byproduct. However, that's a broad spectrum insecticide. Even though it's organic, it's still going to kill beneficial insects like bees and praying mantises and things like that. Same with neem. You could definitely use neem, but it's a broad spectrum insecticide as well. And then there are a lot of synthetic insecticides available. And I'll just go ahead and say that by and large, they're all going to be super toxic to bees. And then I also want you to just think about the practicality of spraying an apple tree. So if you have a big old apple tree, like you can see in this photo here, it's not going to be easy to get really thorough coverage, and it's not going to be worth your while even at all to go about trying to spray it. I would say just live with not having really good apples, bag the ones that you can if you have an old apple tree like that. But if folks are going to spray, I think the main thing is that you got to time it really well. That's where the pheromone traps come into play, or it's basically just watching. So after bloom, couple weeks, start to watch the fruit and looking for little reddish marks. So that's the adults laying their eggs and puncturing the outside of the apple. And when you see that activity, that's going to be the time to do the spraying. And then, of course, additional sprays would probably be needed through the year. So for me, if you just have an apple tree or two, the bagging the fruit and using the pheromone traps really makes a lot of sense. If you're going to use an insecticide, the Sidex makes a lot of sense. And if you have an old tree like this, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to spray. Okay, so that's an example of an insect plant problem. We're now going to talk about plant pathogens. So that includes fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, parasitic plants. The photo here shows bacterial canker in a cherry tree. I would just go ahead and say up front here, growing cherries, peaches, nectarines, most stone fruits in our area is pretty hard. Wouldn't recommend it unless you're prepared to use fungicide sprays. Why? Because the conditions of Western Oregon, like the last couple weeks and probably moving forward when it gets a little bit warmer, are really highly conducive to plant diseases. It's moist, it's humid, and those are the conditions that favor plant diseases. We're going to use apple scab on your left-hand side as an example of a plant disease. And apple scab, as the name implies, produces sort of scabby lesions on the actual fruit. It also affects the leaves as well. With plant diseases, it's really important to point out that there has to be 3 factors all lining up for the disease to actually occur. You have to have a susceptible host, so that would be many apple trees, but not all. You have to have the right environment, that's Western Oregon in the spring. And then you have to have the pathogen there, and that would, a lot of plant diseases, the spores will float on the air, so it's going to be hard to not have the pathogen there. So you can do things to basically deal with the host and the environment to try to minimize disease problems. With the apple disease cycle, right now, there's spores basically hanging out that are in the ground in the fallen leaves from last year. And then as the temperature warms up, there's going to be spores. The spores are going to land on the leaves. And then during the growing season, there's another kind of spore that's going to produce additional disease cycles. And then towards the yearly life cycle, the spores will end up overwintering on infected leaves on the ground again. So if you know that the time and place where it's really vulnerable in terms of the life cycle to your intervention, it's raking up the leaves from the base of the tree. So let's see. Okay, a little bit more about the host. So you can avoid apple scab entirely by choosing resistant varieties. Unfortunately, most of the apples that people are familiar with, so the delicious apples, Gala, Brayburn, Fuji, things like that, those are all really susceptible to apple scab, and I wouldn't recommend growing them in our climate. They do much better east of the Cascades, where the conditions are much drier. But if you do want to grow apples, you can choose varieties that are resistant. They just don't get the disease. So Akane, Tideman's Red, Tokyo Rose, those are all examples of disease-resistant apples. So as you are looking at a plant catalog, I would absolutely choose resistant varieties, because then you can do an end around. You can just avoid the problem entirely by just making a good decision up front. Also, in terms of preventive strategies, you can monitor, sort of change the environment a little bit. So the photo here doesn't show it, that's a rose, but by keeping an apple tree nice and open and doing pruning, that's going to help to minimize the disease problem to a degree. And then I already mentioned it, but raking up the leaves at the end of the season is another key strategy that you can do to try to break the life cycle of the apple scab. It's overwintering spores in the leaves by removing the leaves or mulching over them, or adding a little fertilizer to break them down quickly. Those are all strategies you can use to try to break the disease cycle. And then we'll just go ahead and say that if you're going to use fungicides for apple scab, there's a couple available. Lime sulfur is both like lime and sulfur mixed together. There's wettable sulfur, and then essentially all the fungicides that are available at a regular garden center or Home Depot or somewhere like that, those are all going to be registered and for use for apple scab. And then the key is that you're going to need to apply really early and then thoroughly to protect the plant. And then if you are going to use lime sulfur, for example, you should know that it's caustic. If it gets in your eyes, it's going to hurt. So you'd want to basically protect your eyes and skin and lungs if you're using those kinds of materials. We definitely recommend that with plant problems, you try to avoid them in the first place. And that starts with just avoiding pest-prone plants like disease-prone roses, or if you want to grow a linden or tilia tree, don't do it near a patio where the aphids are going to make a big mess and people will want to treat it. I already talked about resistant varieties. There's azaleas that are resistant to azalea lacebug and so on. If you're going to be growing vegetables, crop rotation is recommended. And then attracting natural enemies for insect control. The photo here shows a syrphid fly. Syrphid fly larva will eat aphids and other things like that. The way you attract beneficial insects is by planting lots of pretty flowers, also by having native shrubs and things like that in your yard. it wouldn't be soil school without mentioning soil, that one of the very best ways to prevent problems with your plants is to prepare the soil well. And we overall recommend that adding compost to the soil before planting, digging it in as best you can over the whole area, and then digging plant holes within that smaller, that already amended soil. That's going to be your best bet for setting up plants for success, so that the roots will become established, so that the soil will accept water, so that there's air, and that it's going to allow the plants to establish relatively quickly. Also, you can improve soil conditions by applying mulch over the surface of the soil. Arborist chips are free and they work great. They break down over time. They contribute organic matter to the soil. They also help to keep weeds at bay. They shade the soil and retain water and so on. So those are preventative strategies that you can use to help to grow your healthy plants. And then lastly here, just want to talk a little bit about solve pest problems. This is a project many years in the making with OSU and partners, including West Multnomah, Metro, City of Gresham. Lots of folks across the state have told OSU that, hey, right now there's not a lot of great resources for regular old people for pest management. OSU has great resources that are really intended for commercial agriculture and nurseries and Christmas tree farms and places like that, but not for regular folks who are gardening both in urban and rural landscapes. So as a result, we've been working together for years to develop a website, in essence, an information system focused on pest management for regular old people. You can see the categories we've already talked about. Just going to go ahead and say that we have been working really hard on it. And the plan is that towards the end of 2022, we're going to have a release of about 100 pages. About 50 of those are invasive plants. Then there's the rodents and yellow jackets and things like that. We have performed user testing with regular old people that we recruited for to make sure that it works. We have written the material in plain language. So I have learned to write science-based content in grade 6 to 8 reading level so that it's going to be understandable for regular folks without a scientific background. We have hundreds of photos to try to illustrate the point. You can see how to get rid of blackberry invasive. It is definitely invasive and it'll take over. And then also really importantly, it's peer reviewed. So my colleagues at OSU are reviewing the content to make sure that it's factually correct. And there's going to be a lot of really key information to help people with information that's really just not available conveniently in any one place. How to solve plant problems without pesticides, how to control weeds without herbicides, biological pest control, how to prevent lawn problems. And then on the right-hand side, for mold, for example, if you have mold growing in your bathroom, mold has very few benefits for your structures, but it's part of the natural world. It breaks down like the bread and things like that, but it also has a lot of risks in terms of air quality. And we absolutely don't recommend that people don't do it. So we have lots of stern language, action highly recommended, and the risk card advising people that it's a threat to humans and to kids and adults, property, pets, really annoying, and so on. So that's a summary of what we're doing with Solve Pest Problems. Really looking forward to getting that material out for you all to be able to use. And then here's a quick review of what we've talked about. We've talked about IPM and the process, invasive plants in urban areas as sort of an example. And then we've specifically gone through plant problems and Coddling Moth, apple scab as examples. So now I'd be happy to take questions that have been put into the Q&A if you want to go for it there, Renee.
Great, thank you, Weston. We do have a few questions.
Sure.
So the first one is a technical how-to question about the basal bark application. Are you completely stripping the bark all the way around of the lower plant and then spraying? Or how
no, so with basal bark, the idea is that you have like a penetrating oil in the herbicide mixture, and then that's going to make its way through the bark. So you don't have to strip anything at all. You're just spraying the lower like 18 inches to 2 feet of the bark, and the penetrating oil is going to get it into the cambium, and then it's going to flow down to the root system.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next question is, does integrated pest management have to be complicated? Can you give an example of a very simple method versus some of the more complex ones that you've described?
Let's see. Sure. Aphids on plants, you'll want to monitor. So let's say you're growing broccoli, go out twice a week, lift the leaves, squash the aphids with your thumbs. I mean, it really is a matter of you paying attention and knowing what to look for, and then taking action early.
And it's going to differ. I mean, the treatment's going to differ depending on what the species is. So the treatment might need to be simple, or it might need to be complex.
Yes, so it depends on the pest, it depends on what you're trying to do, it depends on your goals, etc. But the overall is you want to use the most effective things first. And really, truly, like I've grown a lot of like restaurant quality broccoli in a relatively pest-ridden area. And we did it by doing really regular bug control. So we lifted the leaves, we squashed them, and it took a couple times a week monitoring to do that.
Great. Okay, so the next question, I think this question popped up right at the time that you were talking about SIDEX, so maybe that was already answered, but just in case the attendee didn't quite get the answer, the question was, does SIDEX make sense for a home orchard, and what is the cost?
Okay, yeah, SIDEX absolutely makes sense for a home orchard, provided you have trees that aren't huge and you can get really good coverage. And the cost is, it's not cheap. A little small container is going to be a little bit more pricey than your other options, but it's effective and it's targeted. So I don't have an actual dollar value in mind, but I know that it's a little bit pricier than other insecticides.
Great, thanks. Okay, so one more question. This attendee gets squash bugs each and every summer, and they know of no variety of squash that are resistant. So their method of fighting is to pick them and their eggs as much as they can. Some years this works, but some years there are too many. So do you think this person is crazy for continuing to plant squash every year, even though they lose about half of them the time?
Sure, that's a great question. So number one, if you can move to a whole new area away from where you've grown it before, that might help if you have a larger space. Number two, it sounds like you're doing about what you can do. I would urge you to check out Cornell University has a publication on resistant cucurbits. So you might be able to find a variety there. And then I think if you know you're going to have squash bug problems, I would build little insect netting or row cover fabric cages that you would put over your seedlings and get them going. So the key is, like, if you can get squash, past the first 3-4 leaves to really be a little bit better, they're going to be able to ride out some squash bug damage. But if the squash are just seedlings and they're really small and they're going to get hammered by them, they may or may not make it after that. So all of those would be strategies that you could do. Insecticides aren't going to be particularly effective for squash bugs.
Great, thank you. So there was one question that Cami answered by typing in the answer, but it's just in case you have more information about where to get arborist wood chips. Any recommendations?
Sure. With arborist wood chips, Chip Drop is a service in our area, and you can go to their website and order a chip drop. I would just say you got to be prepared for like a 7.5 or more yard pile of chips, which is not a small investment of your time to move. So if they're going to drop it in your driveway, that's cool. If they're going to drop it on the street, you got to be prepared to get that off really, within a couple of days, to be courteous to your neighbors and before it rains and, sort of soaks into it there. So, but Chip Drop is a great source of free wood chips. And the great thing about arborist chips is they have a lot of sort of carbon-rich material, but also some nitrogen-rich material, and the combination of which really breaks down nicely to help to enliven and enrich soils.
Great, thank you. I did look into them at one point, and I saw that they could be up to as much as 20 yards. So
Okay, in
order carefully.
that's a lot of chips, and yeah. And you can also go in on it with your neighbors, but you got to be prepared with wheelbarrows and buckets to move a lot of chips.
Yes, for sure. So we have a few more minutes, and we actually, I think we've gone through all of the questions. Is that right? Yeah, we've gone through all the questions in the Q&A, but we have a couple more to supplement. So the first is, how should we weigh the environmental impact of flaming, which burns fossil fuel, versus herbicide for weed control?
Yeah, great question. Using petroleum products is obviously not advised with regards to fossil fuel. And there's a lot of, you could do some scuffle hoeing and have just as much effect pretty quickly. So the thing about flame weeding is that you're using it's most effective on very small weeds, very small broadleaf weeds, like when they just have a couple true leaves even. And using some elbow grease and a sharp hoe, you're going to be able to do it probably just as fast or faster anyway. I guess it doesn't really work very well for patios. For patios, you could use hot water if you wanted to, or you could use a organic herbicide if you wanted to. I guess all the products, the synthesized chemicals, those are ultimately coming from petroleum stock as well. So there's that. But I would say with regards to climate change, your gardening activities are probably less of a situation than your driving activities. So I would focus on, what you really can control with carbon emissions. And that, I guess the exception would be for lawn care. So you can very much move away from internal gas combustion engines for mowing lawns these days. The new battery powered equipment is pretty robust, and it works pretty well, or plug-in battery or plug-in electric.
Great. So we have a couple more questions have popped up, and we may have time for one or two of them.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what can you do to avoid or treat aphids in linden trees?
Okay, so avoiding and treating aphids in linden trees. Don't grow linden trees. Don't grow them in a patio or like by your driveway or your car where it's going to be an issue. If you're going to grow them out in a field where it doesn't really matter if it gets all sticky because of all the honeydew that comes off. Other than that, I don't have much to say about it other than it is a pest-prone tree, and I wouldn't recommend growing it in the wrong location. If you already have one growing there, then unfortunately there's not a lot you can do. There are systemic insecticides like the neonics that it's actually illegal to use now for linden because of the bee kills that we've had in recent years. So unfortunately, there's no good answers for that.
Okay, yeah, this person has one in their garden. And so next question, is there a treatment for an evergreen tree canker?
Oh, you'd have to figure out exactly what it is, and I can't really say that without knowing what kind of tree and the thing. But with cankers, you can just cut them out in general. So if it doesn't look good, just cut off that branch.
Great. Okay. And then one last question. Any advice about how to find slugs at nighttime? This person knows that they're there, but haven't seen them when they look at night.
Okay, a flashlight, you should see slime trails. And then I think the main thing is just where do they hide? Slugs hide under, like in crevices, and you can, I guess, wait for them or just try to follow their slime trails.
Great. That's a wonderful note to end on, slime trails.
Slime trails.
Well, thank you so much, Weston. This was a really wonderful presentation, and everybody look for the recording on Tualatin's YouTube channel by the end of the month. And we have 2 more sessions, our last 2 sessions next week, Tuesday and Thursday. So if you have not registered, there's plenty of space and they're free. So we look forward to seeing everybody then. Thank you again, and see you next time.
Okay, thanks, folks. Take care.
Good night.